So this is our final gathering of our first Saturday club that we've had going for the last year and a half. Commemorating the, what Pope Benedict called the Year of Faith, the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council. So we've looked at we have actually touched on, we will, by today's finish, we will have touched on all the 16 documents. And we'll do the last two today. And that will at least give us, I think, a little bit of a overview of the kind of thinking that was going into these documents. Some of them, they're more prophetic than others. Some of them set specific policies. Others, pretty much like the communication one, got outpaced quicker than the bishops might have expected. But all of them have a certain sense of a thrust of moving the church forward into the modern era, into the modern world that was really undergoing tremendous change. Really, the Second World War was the impetus that helped us begin to realize that we were a global village, and that transportation became more accessible, communications became more rapid and more thorough. So the whole world was just becoming more conscious of who we are as a human family on this planet since the Second World War. So the bishops were caught up in that, and they were trying to get the church to address these contemporary issues. As we mentioned a couple months ago, one of the main things that Pope John had in mind when he convened the council, when he first announced it, was that he felt that there needed to be better collaboration among the Christian churches in the world. He felt that it was a scandal that Christianity had splintered into so many segments that it couldn't really give a very credible witness to a world that was becoming conscious of itself as a collection of diverse cultures and nationalities and languages. And the Catholic Church is ideally suited to be a witness of universality because the Catholic Church exists practically everywhere in the world. And yet, because of the divisions in Christianity, this was not a very helpful sign. So that was one of his original desires. And so the bishops knew that right from the start, and they were willing to tackle that. And as we said 2 or 3 months ago, when we did 2 of them, they realized it was more complicated than they expected it would be. So they knew they had to address the other Christian, Catholic, Eastern churches. Now, when we say Eastern churches, we don't mean the church in China or in Japan. That would be what we would speak of today as Eastern. But in the ecclesiastical language, the Eastern churches are what we call the Middle East today. So it's all around Israel, all around the eastern part of the Mediterranean basin, Greece, that part of the world. So that's where the church began, and those various rites, the Byzantine rites, the Melkites, the Maronites, the Chaldeans, Celtic, all variety of rites there that make up the Eastern churches. So they had to deal with that because we were really, to be candid, pretty arrogant about the way we treated the other rites, thinking that the Latin rite, because it was the most numerous, was the Catholic rite. And so we had to eat a little humble pie there and realize that all these different rites have apostolic origins, and they have a right to be here. They're part of the family and equal standing, even if they're smaller than some other rites. Truthfully, in the West, we had rites too. The Ambrosian Rite in Milano still, in fact, is celebrated occasionally, at least in the cathedral. The Mozarabic Rite in Spain. The Irish had a specific rite. The Dominicans said Mass a little differently than everybody else in the Latin Rite. When I was a kid, there was a Dominican priest who would come and visit his family in our parish, and so some of us learned how to serve Mass for a Dominican priest. It was different from the typical Latin Mass. So there were other rites in the Western Church too, but the Western tendency was to consolidate and unify stuff. In the East, there's more of a tendency to maintain the unique cultural heritage of each group. So that's why there's 20 or 25 Eastern rites, and now there's only basically one Latin rite. All right, so they did that. And then they did the one on ecumenism. And ecumenism means other Christians. So the word ecumenism talks about the household, one household, even though we've had some spats and fights and divorces and we've had some burnings at the stake back and forth. So nevertheless, we're all one household. So that's the Christian religions or denominations trying to communicate with each other. Another whole issue is the other world religions. And so that's what we're going to deal with today. And then fourthly, they simply had to do some theoretical readjustment about how you know the truth and how you are able to dialogue with people who have a different perspective than you do and still be getting at the same truth. How is that possible? Because the main mentality was that those who have the truth, they're right, and everybody else is wrong. And so you just simply have to face that. Well, when you're doing this kind of dialogue, you can't really keep insisting, we're right and you're wrong. That doesn't create very healthy dialogue. So they had to do some readjusting of what is the notion of conscience and freedom of conscience when it comes to religion. So those are the two documents that we'll deal with today. The impetus for what is now called the non-Christian religions really was specifically to create a better dialogue between the Christian church and the Jewish religion, because there was a tremendous feeling of collective guilt in at least among the religious leaders, but also among sociologists and psychologists. Lots of people across the Western world were just so chagrined at what happened in Nazi Germany that a whole people could be singled out and genocide, literally, against a certain group of people. How could we do that? And how could a Christian nation pull that off? And so there was a lot of soul searching going on in the 1950s, late 40s and 50s, into the 60s, in all different fields. So the bishops had a lot of impetus to deal with this issue of Christian and Jewish relationships. The problem is that in 1960, 62, 65, the State of Israel had just been established a few years earlier, 1948, and the Eastern Catholic bishops who live in that area, many of them are Arabic by nationality, speak Arabic as their first language at home, and they were just insistent that we don't come off sounding like we are supporting the political movement of the creation of Israel. So they were, every time it came to the floor, somebody would speak about that. We can't be just supporting the state of Israel because of the way that they crazily drove out everybody who was living there before. And so that was really an issue. So they decided to step back and make this be a statement about the Christian religion and Catholic Church in relationship to all the world religions. So the whole world is a family of religions, and all these religions are asking some of the basic questions. What is life? What's the meaning of life? Well, why is there suffering? How do you cope with the face of death? What does it mean to have a sense of purpose in life? All these kinds of existential questions. All the great religions are asking those questions. All the great religions have some kind of an ethic of what is the right way to live. And they have usually a method of living in a faithful way. So Buddhists have the Eightfold Path and this kind of thing. So what they do is they make a fairly brief, I think this is the shortest of the documents, it's only I think 8 paragraphs, make a very brief survey of all the world religions. So we'll just take them one at a time here very briefly. So in paragraph 2, they talk about Hinduism and Buddhism. One paragraph dedicated to those two, about at least a half of the human race. And so they give some credit to those religions. Paragraph 3 is about Islam. And so they do have a specific paragraph there just about Muslims. Now, we in Detroit were already aware of some Muslims at this point, although not really very many. We knew some Maronites and a few Chaldeans at this point in the 1960s. We didn't know too many Muslims yet, but of course now, 50 years later, we know a lot more. But they were conscious of this, and they make reference to Muslims having the same basic roots in Abraham. So they get a paragraph there. And then paragraph 4 is specifically about the Jews. They are very mute about how they describe this. They don't use the word Jew right away. They talk about descendants of Abraham. And so they gradually have several points that helps us realize that we are, in fact, part of this covenant that God made with originally Abraham and then Moses, and that Christ is we see Christ as the fulfillment of that, but it's still part of our heritage. So we are not totally independent. So I'll just point out some of these paragraphs very briefly. By the way, Pius XII had made a statement sometime, I forget what the occasion was, probably one of his radio addresses, where he refers to us Christians that we all have Abraham as our father in faith. So he used that expression, that Abraham is our father in faith, which for many Catholics probably woke them up a bit. We never would have been thinking along that line. So there was this kind of gradual awareness happening. By the third section of paragraph 4, they talk about Jesus being Jewish, and the apostles are Jewish, and even though Jerusalem did not know the time of its visitation, they quote Luke 19, that's where Jesus weeps over the city of Jerusalem in St. Luke's Gospel. Nevertheless, the Jews remain very near to God and dear to God, and they have a strange way of saying it, that the covenant with these people on God's part, God never repented over that. God did not repent over making covenant with the children of Israel. So that means that it's still in place. God didn't repent over it. That covenant has not been canceled by the new covenant. Now, that does come as news to most Christians. We speak of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and typically we're thinking that the Old Testament is over now, it's old, and we have the New Testament, which is the Testament. But they're saying, no, that original covenant is still in place and is simply flourishing in a way that had never been anticipated before, except for some hint or awareness of a Messiah kind of emerging on the horizon at about the time of Christ. But in any case, St. Paul, as a Jew, does not say that Christ replaces the old covenant. Christ fulfills the covenant. So it's one covenant that's blossoming in a new and fertile way. And as St. Paul says, the branch of the Gentiles being grafted onto the original tree is creating a new kind of fruit, but it's still the original root that is still forming the impetus of this relationship with God. So they're able to say that. Now, that is something that most Catholics would not have thought of before. And then in section 5, they make a specific reference that we can profitably join with Jewish scholars in studying the scriptures and poring over them, helping us understand what these scriptures mean. The Dead Sea Scrolls are, I think, have been discovered by this time, in the 40s. Okay, so they already are aware of these scrolls, and they're beginning to do some research into them. So there's this awareness that Jewish scholars really have something to say to Christians about how to read the Bible. And a great example of that is Father Neuhaus, David Neuhaus, who is a Jesuit priest, but he's Israeli by birth. Grew up in South Africa, was sent to Israel by his parents to get a good, solid foundation in the fatherland in Israel. And while he was there, met a Catholic nun, and by the time he was 17, decided he wanted to become Christian. His parents did a very wise thing. They said, well, this is very interesting. Pray over it, but don't make any decision for 10 years. And so in other words, this may just be a flash in the pan of this kind of brash young man, very smart, but in a year or two it'll probably pass. Well, he did what his parents asked him to do. He stayed for 10 years, and then after that got baptized and joined the Jesuits. And currently he is the bishop's vicar, the patriarch's vicar for the Hebrew-speaking Christians in Israel. So he's a citizen of Israel, and he then is the minister. He's pastor of 3 or 4 parishes, or the vicar to these 3 or 4 parishes, where they are Hebrew-speaking, many of them from Eastern Europe, but they're Christian. And so there's these tiny little parishes that have that unique character. He is the vicar there. He comes to Detroit once in a while. He'll be here in June, and his insights into the scriptures are just mind-blowing. It's just so exciting just to sit and listen to him talk. And here's a great example of someone who's steeped in the heritage of the original covenant, and reading the scriptures and what it means to talk about the land and all this kind of thing. It's just very enjoyable. So he'll be here in June. Keep your ears open for when and where. Probably about the 3rd week of June. And there's another scripture scholar who will be here also at the same time, also from Israel. But he's I forget, he's not Israeli, but he's a good scripture scholar also. So the 2 of them are going to do a workshop in June here in Detroit.
16th
So,
to the 19th.
what is it? 16th to the 19th. Okay. His name is Neuhaus, Neuhaus. Yeah, Neuhaus. It's a German sound word, Neuhaus.
Did you mention that he lived with some Muslims when he was over there?
Yes, he also has a good relationship with Muslims, and he has done work with youth groups, Jewish and Arab youth, and because he's able to use their languages because the Hebrew language and the Arabic language are fairly similar, and so he gets these kids to talk to each other and learn each of them learning the other's language and seeing the similarities in their language. So yeah, he's been involved in that kind of interaction for several years too. So anyway, that's what this 4.5 is about, that the Jewish tradition really has something to offer us. Incidentally, way back when, by about the 200s, there was a theologian, I don't know what his status was, he may even have been a bishop, but he certainly was a presbyter, who, Marcion was his name, Marcion, who said that we don't need the Old Testament, it's finished. All we need is the New Testament. And he was excluded for that. He said the collective wisdom of the church at that time, which is still pretty much an underground church, said, no, we do respect the revealed Word of God in the Psalms, in the Pentateuch, we really believe that is part of Revelation. So right in the very beginning, there was this instinct that we can't just discard the whole Testament. So that's what paragraph 4.5 is about. Then in paragraph 4.6, they deal specifically with the issue of who is guilty for the death of Christ. And they say two things. You can't assume that every Jew at the time of Jesus was in the conspiracy to arrest and crucify Christ. It was only a few people of the Jewish leaders who assembled a rabble to shout in front of Pilate, but it would not represent the whole Jewish population at that time, nor can you say that any Jews living today are in any way responsible for the death of Christ. And so they explicitly say that Jews should not be rejected as if, may his blood be upon us and on our children, that you could infer from statements like that the Jewish people have been cursed by God or are deserving of punishment by God. That's just nonsense and that should not be taught. So they make a specific reference that in religious instruction we have to make sure that we are clear about this, that we don't communicate those kinds of prejudicial statements or mentality. Then they have a more general statement about even though we're not talking about political considerations here, they make a point of that. They frequently mention this is not a political statement. Nevertheless, in religious charity, we are firmly and clearly against any kind of persecutions, hatred, demonstrations, anti-Semitism directed against the Jews or anybody else in any time or place. So they make a specific statement about the fact that there simply shouldn't be any kind of persecution or anti-Semitism, that kind of thing. In 4.8, they talk about how Christ came for everyone. This is a very interesting statement, and it has repercussions in the also among different Christian groups that think about how did Jesus' death redeem us? What's the atonement all about? What does it mean to say Jesus died for our sins? So this is a lively discussion that goes on among a variety of Christian groups too. And so they make this statement: Christ, as the church has always maintained, went willingly with immense love to his passion and death because of, propter is the Latin word, because of the sins of all people, so that all may obtain salvation. Now, the word propter is a fairly broad word. it means because of or on account of, but it can also mean someone who is like an attorney, standing with someone or for someone. So there's a kind of a broad range of meanings when that word propter is used. So Christ stands for us all in that sense. And so Jesus, in other words, takes on human nature in all things except sin, but it's us that he's joining. And so he goes with immense love to his passion. So it's an act of pure love that Jesus has for us. The Word of God becomes flesh, loves us so much that he's willing to stand with us and for us. And when you're standing with and for people who are steeped in sin and anger and hostility and violence and all these things, you're going to get bloody. It's going to happen. You're going to get, it's going to slap you in the face too. You can't help it. So that's what Pope Francis talks about, that you've got to get your feet muddy if you're going to be working with the poor. So that's what they're saying here. And notice that it isn't just for those people who have consciously chosen Christ as their personal Savior, but it's everybody. Christ has stood with the whole human race for the benefit of the whole human race. So everyone benefits from the saving act of Christ. This is a very important statement. And this is the Catholic teaching. It's not necessarily universally Christian, but it's certainly the Catholic teaching that Christ dies for everyone. So they make that statement there in this particular paragraph about the Jewish faith and how Jesus is engaged. He's dying for the Jewish people as well as everybody else. In paragraph 5, they go on to kind of summarize what they're talking about. If we're going to say God is the Father of us all, we have to start living as brothers and sisters. Whoever does not love does not know God. And then, once again, they make a statement at the end of paragraph 5. The Church condemns as foreign to the mind of Christ any kind of discrimination whatsoever between people or harassment of them, done by reason of race or color or religion or class. Now, class is conditiones, and that is a very general word that means any kind of adjective you can describe a person with, whether it's their rank, their condition in life, their birth, whether they're legitimate or not. That would be the kind of thing that you're using here. Marital status, your gender, any of these things would be included in the word conditiones. So that's really the Council's inclusive statement. Here at Christ the King we have an inclusive commission, and we have made a welcoming statement that pretty explicitly includes everybody. This is where the Council does their inclusive statement at the end of the document on the relationship between Christians and other religions. So it's a very brief document. It's only 5 paragraphs. And it isn't just about the Jews. The bishops who were from places where there were large Jewish populations, like New York, Chicago, the Bishop of Chicago spoke a couple times. St. Louis, Cardinal Ritter spoke about this more than once. These bishops, where there was a Jewish population, really were insistent that we make some statement like this. But of course, the Middle Eastern bishops were really insistent that it not come off as a political support of the state of Israel. Incidentally, sidebar here, just a few days ago, a book came off the press called My Promised Land. The author is Ari Shavit, S-H-A-V-I-T. The subtitle is The Triumph and the Tragedy of Israel. This guy grew up in Israel. His grandfather was one of the Zionists who established the state of Israel. And what he's doing here is very frankly admitting, and it's pretty much apparently the most clear statement of grief and sorrow over the injustice done to the Palestinians by establishing the state of Israel. So that's why he calls it the triumph and the tragedy of Israel. So I haven't read it yet, but I think it'll be worth reading. This may be an important part of the dialogue going forward, if we could. Now, he's, of course, getting lots of, it's raising a lot of sand in Israel, but he's a son of Israel, so he's able to speak. So we'll see whether or not we can make some headway in this regard. The bishops in the council would have been really mortified and terribly saddened if some prophet had come into St. Peter's and said, you know what, you guys, 50 years from now, they're still going to be living in those camps in Jericho and whatnot. Just the other day, there was a few pictures. In fact, it might have been advertised in this book. I don't know if there's any pictures in this book. But there was a picture of a group of people fleeing from their village, carrying whatever bundles they could carry, on a bridge. I don't know where this bridge is, but there's this photograph of people coming across on this bridge. I was 8 years old, standing on the radio in our house, and the reporter was there, was reporting this event, and you could hear the people crying as they were walking by. And I'm saying to my mother, what in the world is happening? My mother says, I don't know what's happening, but it doesn't sound right to me. Now that was 50 years, 65 years ago now, when that was happening. So it's a sadness that we still have to deal with. And so the bishops are coping with it here as best they can. And actually, this has been a very helpful document, helping us do interfaith dialogue. So this is the other dimension. Ecumenism is inter-Christian, and this is interfaith dialogue, and both are important. So, all right. Incidentally, most of these documents, we sometimes get the impression that there was a lot of debate and that they just barely passed by maybe 51% majority or something. But now this particular document was passed in October 28, 1965. Most of the work they did, 11 of the 16 documents were passed in the last session in 1965. They only had passed liturgy and communications in the second session, and then they passed ecumenism and De Ecclesia, Lumen Gentium, and Eastern churches, those three in the third session, and then in the fourth session, all the rest of them. So October 28, 1965, this document is passed. 2,221 votes for, 88 votes against, 3 invalid votes. So that's about 96% majority for that one. So even after there was some flurry about it, it's pretty much pretty almost unanimous vote. The next one, it was not unanimous. This one was the one that drew the most opposition as it was being drafted, and it did not get a 100% firm affirmation, but it got about 88% in favor of it. So this is the Declaration on Religious Freedom. And they had to do this because if they're going to have a genuine dialogue with other Christians and with other religions, they've got to somehow realize that everybody has some basic right to hold the position that they hold. That you have to allow people to genuinely be searching by whatever lights they have and come to the truth as best they can, and then genuinely listen to these other people who disagree with you, but listen to them. Why do they say what they say? Why do they believe what they believe? You've got to give them credit for a genuine search. Even if you think you're right, you've got to give the other party credit for trying to figure out what is right also. And actually, you can learn something from them. Now, that's a new thought for Catholics. Ever since the Inquisition, we have not thought stuff like that. Ever since the first councils. A real sadness that most of us Western Christians don't think about is after Chalcedon, now we're going back to the year 400 something, when they were trying to figure out how is Jesus true God, but also truly human. What is this business of two natures? Does he have two natures? Does he have two persons? If he only has one person, no, it's only one person. Well, if he has one person, does he have two intellects? Does he have two wills? If he has one will, And they really splitting hairs here, but they're trying to figure out how can we make this preposterous statement that Christ is both human and divine. So they have a couple different councils, Chalcedon and Ephesus and then Chalcedon, I think, to try to hammer this out. Well, they came up with language that the majority of the bishops could affirm, although, keep in mind, those councils never had 2,000 bishops at them. Transportation was, so difficult. You had representative bishops from different parts of the world, but sometimes the Bishop of Rome couldn't even attend these, but he would write a letter or something like that. Much of the eastern part of Christianity didn't accept the formula of Chalcedon, and yet they still claim to believe in the two natures, but they just don't think they were saying it right. And so there was this schism that took place way before 1054, and much of the Eastern Church that had extended into Iraq and also out into India and even as far as China was pretty much excluded. They're called the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church of the East, and they were outside the pale, as it were, for hundreds of years. So anyway, what this statement here about religious freedom is about, that you've got to listen to the partners in the dialogue. But incidentally, Pope John Paul II did have dialogue with some of those Eastern churches, and so some of them actually have been reunited. But of course, the Eastern churches, every bishop is independent. So even if he makes an agreement, now as far as Latins are concerned, once the Pope makes the agreement, we all agree with it. But in the Eastern Church, any patriarch can make the agreement, but the other patriarchs, they may not. So I don't know if it's gotten that far in practical ways, but at least we accept them anyway. All right, so here's this document on religious freedom. Well, so they're speaking about the need for everybody to be free to have whatever religion they have. But that means they've also got to make statements just about conscience itself. How do we know the truth? And how do we know what is good? And that is really the nub of this. So even though the actual rationale and the reason for this document is to justify interreligious dialogue, it really is about the freedom of conscience. So sometimes people refer to this document as freedom of conscience, although technically they were specifically talking about freedom of religion, but they can't say freedom of religion without including any conscientious decision that a person makes. So it's very important from that point of view. So they begin with the dignity of the human person. And this is kind of a new thrust. It's not brand new in human philosophy. It has been around for several decades, but the dignity of the human person, we are becoming increasingly aware of this. So this is something that's just kind of coming up over the horizon. There's a new sun rising over the horizon, the dignity of the human person. In growing numbers, people are demanding the use of their own responsible judgment and freedom, and decide on their actions on grounds of duty and conscience without external pressure or coercion. So you can't force a person to know the truth. You have to allow that person to explore the truth, and you can do what you can to discuss with them, to help them understand how you see it. All those kind of conversations can go on, but you can't use external pressure or coercion. Now, they go back to Pius XII, who talked about the responsibility of human conscience. Of course, Pius XII was pretty much convinced that a well-formed conscience would always be the way Catholics think. But in any case, what he does say, he does give credit for the well-formed conscience. And of course, this is from Thomas Aquinas, too. Aquinas believed that, and so we've always taught that a person has to act on their conscience. Thomas even uses a specific example of if a person, and I forget what example it is he uses, if a person believes that he has to do a certain thing or believe a certain thing, he has to do it because that's his conscience. John the 23rd makes explicit reference to this in Pax Terris, which by now has been published when he's during this time, and so they are able to quote John the 23rd as well. Notice that in the 1960s, it was the height of the Cold War. So you had the emergence of the Soviet Union, Maoism in China is underway. So you've got countries, whole countries, that are calling themselves atheistic and not permitting any religions. So this is really a groundswell going on, and so some of these bishops are living in places that are becoming atheistic communism, and so they're speaking in their own self-interest in that case, that we have a right, even though the government may not believe in God, we have a right to promote the belief in God and to educate our children. And to have whatever institutions we think are important. So this is in the self-interest of a lot of Catholics who are living in countries where have gone communist. So that, from that point of view, there's a fairly good impetus here too. Now, in the second and third part of paragraph 1, we state our position as Catholics. So we believe that this one and only true religion subsists in the Catholic and Apostolic Church. That's a fairly subtle statement. It doesn't say that the Catholic Church is the only religion. It says the true religion subsists in the Catholic Church. Now that may seem like splitting hairs, but it's a theological crack in the door. It allows for the fact that truth can exist elsewhere, and also that other religions have a right to be there, even though we believe that the truth subsists in the Catholic Church. And all people are bound to seek the truth, especially about God and His Church, and when they find it, to embrace it and keep it. Well, all right, so everybody has a responsibility to search for the truth. And then the Catholic assumption is once you discover it, you will become Catholic. But they're not guaranteeing that here. And then into part 3, leaving intact the traditional Catholic teaching on the moral obligation to embrace the one true Church of Christ, quote, this synod proclaims that these obligations touch and bind the human conscience, and truth imposes itself solely by the force of its own truth as it enters the mind. In other words, it's the function of the human reason, the human mind, the human heart, to come to a conviction about the truth. So it comes from within. And this is a very important insight, that it doesn't get imposed from without. You can't force people to know the truth. You have to invite people to discover the truth. And people will discover it by their best lights. The Synod intends to develop a teaching of more recent popes on the inviolable rights of the human person. They go back to that notion of the human person. So this is the introductory paragraph, and it's extremely important because this is Aquinas. This is nothing really new, but it was new for the recent history of the church. Most religions up at this time. And that's not just Catholics, Baptists, Lutheran, whatever. You know, you can't get to heaven unless you're Baptist, right? There's a classic joke, you know, that there's somebody who goes into heaven and there's this wall around and you can hear some laughter inside. Who's in there? Oh, those are the Catholics. They think they're the only ones up here. But of course, you could say those are the Lutherans. They think they're the only ones up here. So that's kind of what they're getting at here. Paragraph 2 then, now there's 2 chapters in this document, and so paragraph 2 begins chapter 1. So the human person has a right to religious freedom and immunity from coercion by individuals or by any human power. That includes religious institutions, any human power, that no one should be forced to act against his conscience in religious matters, nor prevented from acting according to his conscience within due limits. Now there they mean you can't, there are some things like you can't murder people just because you don't like them. So those are the due limits. The right to religious freedom is firmly based on the dignity of the human person, as this is known from the revealed Word of God and from reason itself. So now, you're going to be hard put to find where Jesus says this specifically. But the revealed Word of God is broader than just quoting a single verse from the Bible. It's the whole faith of the church. In the middle of paragraph 2, this is in the top, about 3rd or 4th line on page 3. People are only able to meet this obligation in ways that accord with their own nature, when they enjoy both psychological freedom and freedom from external coercion. Thus, the right to religious freedom is based on human nature itself, not on any merely personal disposition. In other words, just the way they think it, or the way they say it, or the way they're feeling about it. It's your very human nature itself. Therefore, this right to non-interference persists, even in those who do not carry out their obligation of seeking the truth and standing by it. And the exercise of the right should not be curtailed as long as due public order is preserved. So you have to allow a person to be wrong. If you think they're wrong, you have to allow a person to live by their conscience, even if they don't seem to be of goodwill in your mentality. Because human nature itself. Now, then they make a statement that we have to parse. This is paragraph 3. The supreme rule of life is the divine law itself. You know, this is a direct quote, and this is language that's very common in theology, going back as far as Aquinas. The divine law itself, the eternal, objective, and universal law by which God, out of his wisdom and love, arranges, directs, and governs the whole world, and the paths of the human community. So you've got this eternal law of God. And they use this language of the law of God because from the Middle Ages on, well, actually from the Roman Empire, the Romans invented the notion of law as a universal way of behaving, that regardless of where you live or who the emperor happens to be, the law has its own integrity. And people can abide by the law regardless of who the governor happens to be. It's not just the whim of the governor that runs the country, it's the law. So that's an invention of the Romans, and as they went about incorporating more and more territories, they continued to bring the Roman law to these different countries. And regardless of their nationality or the language, you could still learn to abide by this law. So they use that same notion that God is kind of like a lawgiver who has this eternal law and that it governs the whole universe. And then God has enabled people to share in this divine law and hence able to, under the gentle guidance of God's providence, increasingly to recognize the unchanging truth. Therefore, all have both the right and the duty to search for religious truth so that they may, by the prudent use of appropriate means, form for themselves right and true moral judgments. Well, the problem with this statement, and this is very typical stuff in the theological manuals of that day, that it looks like that if we think about it enough, we can actually know what the law of God is. The implication is that we all can learn what the law of God is, and once we learn it, then we live by it. Of course, the problem is you can't. There's no way we can know the will of God. No way we can know the entire mind of God. And Thomas is very clear about this. Aquinas never intended the notion of natural law to be completely encompass divine law. Natural law is only a glimpse that you have into divine law. It gives you a start, it gives you a direction, but it does not encompass the divine law, the divine mind. The divine mind is simply beyond human cognition. There's no way we can know God's law or God's will. So they're not admitting that here. They're not stating that this is really only a fragmentary and a glimpse and a hint and a glimmer that gives us some guidance, maybe. Sort of like maybe the North Star, but you've got to figure out where you're at in terms of this woods and this swamp and this, you keep your eye on where the North Star is, but you can't just constantly aiming at the North Star and go run into a swamp. So that's the issue here that isn't very clearly worked out. So then notice that 3.2, truth, however, is to be sought in a manner befitting the dignity and social nature of the human person, namely, by free inquiry, assisted by teaching and instruction, and by exchange and discussion in which people explain to each other the truth as they've discovered it or as they see it, so as to assist each other in their search. Once the truth is known, it should be embraced by a personal act of consent. And of course, they flip back into that you suddenly will, it's like a shining light. You'll suddenly know the truth. Now you're completely enlightened. They don't admit that this is going to be a very gradual process. But this is a very important statement. It has to be done by the human psychological and social processes of discussion, of searching, of debating with one another, of telling each other what your dreams are, all the kind of things that go on in human encounter to try to grapple with what is the truth, what should we do, what is good here, and that kind of thing. So it really is a human venture. It's an unfolding process, a gradual blossoming of coming to some appreciation deeper and deeper of the law of God. So they're really breaking new territory when they make that statement at this point. Now, incidentally, they've got on record the First Vatican Council. And the First Vatican Council was called in the 1860s, and as a response to rationalism and people who were saying that the only guide is human reason, and that religion is just superstition. What Marx would call, I don't know if Marx was writing it during the First Vatican Council, I don't think he was, but Marx would call this the opium of the people, that religion is just a way of keeping people dumb. And you let the people in charge just tell you what to believe, and that's all you have to do. Well, the First Vatican Council was trying to say, no, all of us, because of our human nature, our reasoning, are able to know something about God. And they quote from Romans 1, where Paul talks about even the pagans who haven't been enlightened by Christ yet, they can know something about God just by looking around at God's creation. That's Paul's assessment. And so First Vatican Council uses that same kind of thing. But then they say, but there's other ways of knowing. So there's reason, human reason helps us know about God, but also faith is another way of knowing. So faith is not just blind faith of like lemmings going over the edge of a cliff. Faith is an awareness, an experience, an insight, a judgment made by people of a faith community that this is so, this is real, this is who God is. And so, there's a little expression, the heart has reasons that reason does not know. So that faith is kind of the reasoning of the heart. It's another way of knowing. So that's the thrust of the First Vatican Council. Now, then they said the next thing is, in case you have any doubt about it, just ask the Pope, because the Pope's infallible, and he'll tell you if there's any question. Well, a lot of people disagreed with that particular strategy, but they didn't have a chance to talk about it any further because the revolution was going on and Garibaldi was literally taking over the papal states right at that moment, and most of the bishops were getting out of town, and they never came back. So they never continued that conversation. Well, yeah, the Pope can be infallible under very narrow circumstances. What about the rest of the teaching church, when they never got to that? So anyway, this is what we have here is trying to kind of push forward that human reason really is an essential part of this, and our grasping in our own conscience is our guide, and that's how we come to God. Now, I've given a little quote that I consider probably the most important thing that Pope Benedict wrote in a single sentence, and it's a little indentation here. Now, he gave this a few months before he resigned. He was giving a talk in Lebanon, and so he was invited to the Middle East to contribute to some effort of the religious leaders of the Middle East to get together a little more about what can we do about establishing some peace in the Middle East. And so in this talk that he gives in Beirut, he has this statement. We know very well, church teachers always know everything very well. We know very well that truth, apart from God, does not exist as an autonomous reality. If it did, it would be an idol. In other words, truth would become a god, and that can't be. The truth cannot unfold except in an otherness open to God. That means a dialogue between people who are struggling to know the truth and God who is the truth. People who wish a God who wishes to reveal his own otherness in and through my human brothers and sisters. In other words, we're all struggling for this truth. Hence, it is not fitting to state in an exclusive way, I possess the truth. The truth is not possessed by anyone. It is always a gift which calls us to undertake a journey of ever closer assimilation to truth. Truth can only be known and experienced in freedom. For this reason, we cannot impose truth on others. Truth is disclosed only in an encounter of love. So that's a very nice statement. Now that was not stated in so many words in the Vatican Council document, but this is the logical development of what they're doing here. So I put that in there because Ratzinger himself was one of the theologians who was crafting this document 50 years earlier, and then here he makes this statement. Clearly, he's talking about interfaith dialogue here. He's talking in Beirut, and he's talking to other religious leaders, which would include Muslims as well as Christians. So obviously there's a context for this, but he's stating this as this is the truth. This is what we all know, that the truth is not possessed by anyone. The truth does not exist out there as an independent reality. If it did, it would be an idol. God is true, but we come to know God only in love. And that's how the truth is gradually unfolds and kind of surrounds us and invites us and embraces us, and we come to live in the truth. So, it's very important.
Your truth can be different than my truth, and we both have it at the same time.
Yeah, because your experiences are different. The question is, your truth can be different than my truth. Well, your experiences are different, and your way of processing every experience of your life is going to be unique. And that includes the current dialogue that's going on between the two of you. And here's a new experience. And so you continually process your experiences. You come to insights every day. But insights are worth about a dime a dozen. And tomorrow you may come to a new insight that pretty much outshadows the other insight that you had. And so you constantly grow at this. You make a judgment when you have to kind of decide, all right, as a group, where do we stand on this? And so we do occasionally make some public statements about what we feel is an expression of the truth, as at least at this point, but we should always have that apostrophe there, that asterisk, at this point, under these conditions, where we are now, there's going to be some continuing unfolding of that truth. So, yes?
I'm still a bit confused about how that relates to the statement in paragraph 3.2 about once the truth is known. The truth is known, different types of truth every day through love.
Yeah, and it continues.
Today we experience this through love tomorrow.
Yeah, and so in other words, you only live your life one moment at a time. So you can say once the truth is known, in terms of here we are right now, and then we make this agreement. But we may not know everything there is to know about it. But that's the best we can come up with right now. So you live with where you're at the moment. Next year, you may have made some progress in a new direction. But right now, you've got to make a judgment at some point. You can't just constantly be reserving judgment because you never get off the pot. You have to kind of decide, all right, let's settle on this. So, for example, the dialogue between Catholics and Lutherans has been going on for 50 years about the nature of salvation. Is it just by Scripture or by works as well? How is the Eucharist? What's happening in the Eucharist? These dialogues are going on. And they're gradually coming to consensus, one item at a time. And it's going to take many more years before you could say that the Catholics and the Lutherans are in total agreement. But right now, we've made some progress here.
But right now, the church is looking at Catholics, they're not.
Within the Catholic Church. Oh, yeah, that's right. And that's a surprise to some Catholics, because they have the impression that we all know the truth. All you got to do is ask the Pope, and you get the truth, and that's it. And so there are certain websites that pretty much proclaim themselves as the truth. This is the Catholic truth. Well, this is saying, no.
Was this whole document more for interreligious dialogue or within the Catholic community, or both? Because it seems to me, we can say all this stuff about, we each come to our truth and this, but you still hear an awful lot of, well, and that's fine, but if you don't believe this, then you can call yourself Catholic.
Yeah, well, you're right, and
You might even get excommunicated.
Right. Yeah, because there's a certain reality of a faith community. So if you're part of a faith community, there's some basic premises that go along with being Catholic or being Buddhist or something like that, and you kind of take those things as given, So yeah, you do arrive at that's the function of judgment, in practical judgment on a day-to-day basis, and conscience too. So you decide, all right, and my faith community helps me to decide that. But the point is that even in a given church, you don't have all the questions answered. We may think we do at a given point, but you've got to be very cautious about saying we're absolutely certain about one thing or the other. That's why in Catholic theology, there are very few things that are absolutely fundamental to what it means to be a Christian or a Catholic. Something about God is a relationship. Words, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but even the words aren't necessarily guaranteed forever. But the concept, the reality of God as a relationship, not as a single monad, that's pretty fundamental to Christian faith. So there are some things that are very fundamental. Other things are pretty much accepted doctrine, but it's developing. In fact, I'm going to make a reference to that before we're finished here about this very document itself. There are developments in. So we take these doctrines seriously, but they're developing. They're in a context, and as the context changes, you've got to rethink it. That doesn't mean you reject it, but you've got to think it in terms of the new experiences. And is there a better way to say it? Have we been omitting a certain thing that needs to be said here? That kind of thing. So the truth unfolds in that regard. And that's a process. And then beyond that, there are theological opinions. And there, you simply have to admit there's different opinions about this. Different teachers have different takes on it. And there's always been what they call, how do you solve it? They use the word probabilism. You can accept a probable opinion, even if it isn't the majority opinion. If it's a probable opinion, in other words, in your reasoning, it's probable, it's possible. You can accept that. All right, you can live by that, even if it's only a minority. The Jesuits and the Dominicans and the Franciscans have been fighting for centuries over a lot of these things, and some of them still don't agree with each other on one thing or the other. They're all Catholic, but they have different takes on one thing or the other. A real important one would be the nature of Christ. Did Christ simply come as an afterthought once Adam and Eve had sinned and the human race is steeped in original sin now, and then God has to think, what am I going to do now? Well, maybe I'll send Christ and he'll show them how to straighten out. And that's been kind of the way most Christians think about it. But Franciscans don't. And Duns Scotus did. They think, no. God was thinking about Christ right from the beginning. So that Jesus has always been in God's mind. And the incarnation is not an afterthought. It's not meant to fill a gap in where sin has messed things up. Christ has been part of the plan right from the start. And that's the way, when you read Ephesians, that's what it looks like. This secret has been a secret for centuries, but now it's finally becoming known in this latter day. So that would be a different opinion, and those are two theological streams of thought that have, continued to be distinct from one another. But they're all Catholic. So anyway, and you're right to point out that the task at hand here is religious freedom, but they can't talk about religious freedom without talking about freedom of conscience. So the implications are deeper and wider than just religious freedom. Let me take a couple of things. This is a document that didn't get 100% agreement because there were so many bishops living in countries like Spain and parts of Italy, Chile, and these bishops, they were still convinced that the Catholic Church is the only church that has a right to speak publicly in any society. Even if the society wants to become communist, the Catholic Church is still the only church that has a right to speak. So some of these bishops just could not. So, for example, Cardinal Taviani. This declaration should be prefaced with a solemn assertion that the Catholic Church has an objective right to religious freedom precisely because of its divine origin and mission. Otherwise, we would equate the Church with an ordinary society. So Taviani he probably did not vote for this. He's the head of the Theology Commission at the time. Here's a bishop from Louisville, Kentucky. Certainly contradictory things, this is an interesting, this is practical. Here's an American. He says, this is kind of in the midst of the discussion about this very document. He says, certainly contradictory things have been said in this discussion, and so some of them must be erroneous. By what right have those who erred, have they spoken? Not by the right of the truth, but by the right of their persons as council fathers, by reason of the faculty of freedom exercised without coercion. So also, the right to religious freedom is the right of a person, even an erring person. Well, that's Bishop Maloney of Kentucky. Hallinan from Atlanta, Georgia, he was one of the main contributors. Now, there's a bishop from Prague, and he talks about this. The great importance of the Declaration of Religious Freedom is confirmed by experience. From the very moment when freedom of conscience was radically restricted in my country, I was witness to not only the grave dangers to the faith, but also the serious temptations to hypocrisy and other moral vices that the opposition of conscience brought in its wake. And then he goes on to talk about the burning of John Huss has damaged our church for centuries. That we didn't allow him the freedom of conscience, and we've been suffering for it ever since. Now, there's a bishop speaking from the point of view of history. Here's Cardinal Sheehan of Baltimore. The Americans participated in this greatly. John Courtney Murray was the Jesuit, American Jesuit, who was one of the initial authors of this. He worked at this. I think he lived to see it passed, although he died shortly afterwards. So the American bishops are involved. So here's Cardinal Sheehan. I heartily approve of the schema. Propose that at the end of the discussion, the status of juridical possession be confirmed from the document by our positive vote. I completely agree with Cardinal Urbani's praise of the doctrinal progress shown in the schema. Many people were quoting from Leo XIII and Pius XI to say that we can't say stuff like this, because they were holding for the Catholic truth. But this doctrinal evolution began with Leo XIII, whose teaching was a noble advance over the Middle Ages and the post-Reformation period. At the heart of Leo's teaching is neither the concept of toleration, which itself represented a step that did not rule out further doctrinal progress. And so then he goes on. And then later, Pius XI defended the liberty of conscience in 2 documents. And then he quotes the documents. Pius XII numbered among the fundamental rights of man the right to public and private worship of God with religious and charitable activity. And then the teaching of John the 23rd is well known. And last year, Paul VI told Representative of the United Nations, one can expect the promulgation of a doctrine on the subject which is of great importance, not only for the church, but for all people, a great number of whom believe that this declaration pertains to them. So Cardinal Sheehan goes back 100 years, starting with Leo XIII, right up to the current reigning pope, to show how there's been this development, always dealing with the issue of conscience, but in their own context. Each of them taking a step forward, but then the next one taking another step forward. That's what it means to say development of doctrine. So the fundamental doctrine is kind of germinating all this time, but it's being expressed in different ways at different times. Cardinal Cardine was a Belgian bishop who was very famous for the so-called young Christian workers and young Christian students. And he got these young people to get together and do some analysis, social analysis, observe, judge, and act. So observe what's going on, make a judgment about what's happening there, and then if that's not right, then let's take an action that will make a correction in what's going on. And then come back a week later, they met every week, and then we'll see, all right, what action did we take? Did it work? Was that the right action? Maybe our judgment wasn't right, so observe, judge, and act over again. So he was promoting that process of conscience development is what he was doing. So he was teaching young people, students and young workers, to use their intelligent reasoning to grapple with social issues of the day and to come to some solidarity. All right, what are we going to do about this? So he speaks in favor of that. Now, on the other hand, you have Marcel Lefebvre. He's the one who, the Holy Ghost priest who actually started the schismatic movement. Since the Catholic Church alone possesses the divine law and has received the command to teach it, the Catholic Church alone has a real right to religious liberty. Other cults may only be said to have some title to public existence and activity insofar as they observe this law. Each case must be judged on its own merit. So he thinks that the Catholic Church does in fact know the mind of God. And therefore the Catholic Church is the only one that has the right to speak. And now he's still fighting the issue of the French Revolution. The French Revolution, really causes schism in the Catholic Church. Those who really resisted any progress toward human liberty, and those who saw that, this is part of the unfolding will of God, and pretty much equivalent to a schism. And Lefebvre is still in that struggle. So,
It's called the Catholic Church of Cults.
other cults.
Right.
Yeah.
There are other cults, that means we are.
No, he doesn't intend that. He doesn't intend that. So this debate was hot and heavy. They finally came to a conclusion in November 19th is when they took the vote. And they got 2,216 in favor of it, 249 opposed, and 13 invalid votes. So it's really only about 88%. This is the lowest of the positive votes. The others were all much more than that, mostly in the 90s, 95, 96%. In this case, they didn't get over 90%. But and you can see why, because these bishops are all speaking from their own experience. Now here you got one guy, Lefebvre, and yet there was another bishop from Prague who says, we should have been doing this 300 years ago, and we're still suffering because we didn't do it then. So each bishop is speaking from the experience of their own church, trying to figure out how does the church teach the truth within an emerging pluralistic environment. Some people felt that this pluralism itself is wrong, so that was Lefebvre's point. So it was quite a strong debate, but it was important to do, and they had to do this because all the things that they were saying about ecumenism, all the things they were also saying simultaneously in the Church in the Modern World was presuming freedom of conscience. So Church in the Modern World goes even further in terms of individual freedoms of conscience in all arenas. This is the one specifically to religion, but yet the principles are here for everybody, for everything. So pretty important document. And one of the, November 19th, it was one of the last ones voted. The very final vote taken was on December 7th. That was Church in the Modern World and one or two others. Most of the voting was done in the fourth session. They were working on these things throughout, but the actual votes weren't ready until. And most of these had several takes at it, all through 1965. They were voting on drafts and sections and then sending them back to committee and then bringing them forward again. And so they ended up, and they didn't know when they were coming in September of '65, how long is this council going to last? And they knew that Trent had gone on about 20 years, and they were certainly hoping this was not going to last 20 years. But they were able to pretty much come up with statements that they felt, all right, we've debated that sufficiently, we've made our comments, we've heard the response of the theologians, all right, this will work. And so the votes, for the most part, were over 2,000 votes for any one of these things. Yes?
All bishops have been trained in Aristotelian, Thomistic, natural law basis for morality.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently that teaching in seminaries hasn't stopped. But this kind of undercuts natural law as the basis for all the stuff that's so hot. Sexuality and birth control and all of those things. Were they aware of, it wasn't just, we got them right and everybody else has got it wrong. It wasn't just that simple. It had ramifications, and I'm wondering if they got that.
They didn't get into it that specifically. The question is about natural law. And Thomas Aquinas and other theologians in the Middle Ages figured out that since human reasoning is part of God's creation, it's one of the gifts that God has given us to get some glimpse into who God is and what God is thinking. So it was a way of saying, yes, we can approach the will of God and the law of God through our human reasoning. And in fact, it's the best we've got. Now, human reasoning is augmented by the community of faith, which comes to a judgment, but that's human reasoning also. So then natural law comes as a kind of looking at nature and seeing how things fit together, and then appreciating, all right, this must be a way God is doing things, because it seems to be natural. The problem is that we can only see what's natural within our own horizon. And we don't know what's beyond the horizon. And so for many centuries, we thought it would be unnatural for people of two different races to marry. In fact, Italians think it's unnatural to marry an Irish person. So there was really this notion that it was unnatural to marry outside of your particular nationality or especially race. And even there were laws in this country against interracial marriage based on natural law. And that's an interpretation of nature. of natural laws. In other words, nature has got to be in quote marks. It's your interpretation of nature, our particular experience of nature. And so the interesting thing in the terms of sexuality is the issue of Pius XI became aware. Well, first of all, back up. The reason why the bishops, like Leo XIII, were against birth control was because they had been told by some scientist who had a microscope that he had examined human sperm and could actually see the little person swimming around in there. Now, obviously, he never could see that. Maybe he thought he was seeing it, but that would fit the nature that Aristotle would have been talking about. And Thomas Aquinas felt that females, for example, are unnatural because the true human nature is the masculine species, and the females are an aborted, not quite natural. And so they thought that the individual person was actually already fully formed within the sperm that was injected into the womb of the woman. She carried it for 9 months, and then it was born as a baby. So Leo thought that it was murder to use any contraception because that little infant in there, in that sperm, is being snuffed out. So that's the rationale. That's a natural thinking process. It's wrong, but it was natural. It seemed natural to him. Pius XI, it comes to the dawning awareness that every act of sex doesn't necessarily produce a child. I don't know where he learned his sexual but somewhere along the line, he has found out that sometimes the act of sex doesn't have a child. And in fact, there's only certain times when a woman can conceive a child. So he then comes to this realization that that's part of nature. So, therefore, it's not sinful to have sex in an infertile time, even if you know that it's not going to conceive a child. Every act of sexuality should be open to having a child, but you might happen to know that right now it will not work. You can still have the act of sex. It's not a sin to have sex then. The fathers of the church didn't believe that. They thought it was sinful to have sex regardless. We just had to put up with that sin in order to get the human race going, but it was sinful. Anything that was unruly was sinful, and sex is obviously unruly, so it's unnatural. See? Sex is unnatural. It's not in the Stoic notion of the perfect human person, the perfect male person who is always in charge of their emotions, right? That's natural. Yeah, sex is not natural. But Pius is not consistent in the sense that but then he says in the same paragraph, or a paragraph later, that every individual act of sex has to be open to having conception. And yet he's already just said that naturally, sometimes human intercourse doesn't have a child. So there's a case where in the same breath, they use two different interpretations of nature. So it's not infallible to be constantly quoting natural law. It's really only supposed to be a hint. It's supposed to be a guideline. It's supposed to give you some direction. But a really important insight in all this thing is not in the council documents anywhere, but it's in moral teaching nowadays. More of the contemporary moral theologians talk about universal standards or norms and general standards or norms. Universal would apply pretty much all the time. It's simply not right to kill somebody just for your own convenience. You can't do that. But generally, lots of things are true in one place but not true in another. So that certain habits, certain customs will prevail in different places because it's generally done differently in different places. So when you think, but many people think that how we generally do things is natural law. Well, no. If you're going to make it be a matter of morality and what is permitted and what is sinful, you've got to say, what is universal? And go based on that. What's that? Yeah, there's a good case. Nelson Mandela is a good example of someone who was really speaking to the nature of the human person, right? He's doing this thing here. Everybody has a right to be in this country. Everybody has a right to vote for who the president's going to be. And so that was his notion of the nature of human beings. Incidentally, there's a nice article coming out in National Catholic Reporter about the amount of credit that Mandela gave to the churches in South Africa, where he himself went to school. He didn't go to Catholic schools, but he went to, in those days, there were other religions had schools too. Sadly, in South Africa, there was an educational act that pretty much took over the religious schools, except the Catholic schools. Catholic bishops maintained those schools despite the fact that they had to run them completely on their own and got no public support for them. The other schools pretty much became public schools. And so, and of course it was against the law to have kids of different races in the same school. But the Catholic schools, at first they went along with it, but they didn't do that very long. And then they ended up just having whatever kids were in the neighborhood come to their school. And they didn't get closed down for that. So anyway, Mandela talks about the interaction he had with various pastors, the pastors who came to visit him when he was in jail, the Catholic priests who came to visit him. He knew, somehow he found out before anybody else that a certain bishop was going to become a cardinal. And this bishop was chagrined at it. He told the delegate when he got the phone call, "You must be kidding. No, the Pope wants you to be a cardinal." And he was very quiet about it, didn't tell anybody. Mandela called him and congratulated him. However, he found out, nobody knows. So anyway, the notion of natural law is a very important issue, but that's not the end-all and be-all. It's only it's a fundamental structure that we use, but you have to be cautious about thinking what's natural.
What are your take on how you feel when the Catholic Church tells people to talk about?
We claim we don't do that. The question is, can the Catholic Church tell us how to vote? The basic policy of the National Council of Catholic Bishops is that we do not support partisan politics at all, so that you can't go one way or the other. You can't be telling people to vote for a certain political party. But you can promote certain public issues that have moral implications. So, there again, they have taken a lot of liberties in terms of interpreting for us which is the proper way to vote on a given issue. And so they claim that, we all have a right to try to convince one another about the importance of one issue or another, what will be the implications of a certain issue. But the problem is whether or not it really is worth it to sabotage a whole healthcare law based on an opinion about birth control. So that would be the case of it. Technically speaking, no pastor should have been saying you can't vote for Jennifer Granholm. Some places did, but you shouldn't have. And that's because of a specific issue that be for or against. So we're not supposed to be promoting any political candidate for or against. And the only time we can raise issues if we think it's important that has moral implications. But beyond that, it's supposed to be, we're supposed to be able to use our own conscience. Right? Can you understand?
It's just a comment. I mean, the Archdiocese of Detroit spent $500,000 advertising against Proposition 2 6 years ago or whatever.
Yeah. On the assumption that it's a moral issue. Yeah.
By doing that, they're trying to make it a Catholic state, I think.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. That would be some of the truth has no, I mean, falsehood has no rights, error has no rights. And so it looks like that's what they're trying to do. And that's not appropriate in a pluralistic society.
Proposition 2, clarify what Proposition 2 was. Right, gay marriage.
Yep. And unfortunately, we end up, right now the bishops, of course, say that we never have said anything nasty about homosexuals, but they have mounted explicit campaigns against open housing for homosexuals and stuff like that across the country. So they're just not being truthful when they say that. Over here's a question.
And the ramifications of this kind of take of trying to change, law or whatever. I don't know, it speaks on page 2 here, 5.3. You spoke to most of it, but the very last part where Matthew 5 is quoted, it says the church condemns as foreign to the mind of Christ any kind of discrimination whatsoever between people or harassment of them, done by reason of race, color, religion, class. I mean, they were about as inclusive, as you said, as they knew to be at that time.
Yep.
But then after the hiatus there, it says, at peace with all people, so that they may really be children of the Father who is in heaven. And that's taken from Matthew. When we discriminate against any group of people,
By class.
we're not allowing them to live out their inherent right to be children of the Father. And so the ramifications of this are people not only leaving the church, but leaving their relationship with God. Because they're told from very early on, you are wrong, the church doesn't accept you, God doesn't accept you. And we think that doesn't happen, but I tell you it does. So many people have shared their lives, and it takes a whole lifetime to heal the wounds from this kind of thinking. God does not accept you.
And I think that's what Pope Francis is trying to recalibrate the moral compass here, in terms of when he says things like there are different gradations of truths. Some are more important than others. Some take precedence over others. There are certain gradations of sin. I think that what he's speaking of there is that it's not a huge issue about birth control. Does that have to be a moral public issue anymore? Granted, 100 years ago, druggists couldn't sell birth control, but that's been changed. There's no sense fighting that battle anymore. So I think he's going to be calling for us to use more discriminating judgment and see what are the more important issues here. And certainly, the dignity of the human person is a fundamental, important issue. So they're using the right language here. They've got the right idea. Now it's a matter of practically seeing how it applies in all different situations.
How am I called to love today?
Yeah.
How is the gospel of Jesus?
Yeah, call me to love
today?
Yep.
In the same document, and on page 2 in
paragraph, your comment on paragraph 4.8. It was interesting to me that we get from that, and I'm glad you mentioned Duns Scotus, because I think that gives a different theory to that notion of sacrifice and purchase agreement and so on. But I was interested how we get from this in 4.8 to the new translation in the liturgy of Christ died for many.
Yeah.
The bishops didn't read this.
Yep. And that's a poor translation. That's an ignorance of how the Greek uses the word many. And then the Latin, of course, comes from the Greek, but doesn't have an article like the Greek does. The Greek talks about the hoi eristoi, the privileged few, kai, and hoi polloi. That means the many. The word translated is the many, but that means everybody else, right? So you got the privileged few and everybody else. That's hoi eristoi and hoi polloi. So that very typical Greek sentence or statement is translated into Latin pro multis, for many. The Latin doesn't have a the for the many to make sure you understand it's the, you privileged few. So when Jesus at the Last Supper says, take this, all of you, and eat, and this is shed for you and for the many. Well, you who are privileged to sit with me right here and now, and then the many is everybody else. And so it should be all, for you and for all. That is the correct translation of the Greek and Latin. And they've mistranslated it by making it many, just because multis in Latin does mean many. If you're just talking about, well, how many people came to the family gathering? Oh, there was quite a few, multis, there were quite a few. Did everybody come? Well, no, not everybody, but multis. So you can use the word to mean many in the English sense, but in that sentence, for you and for many, it means for you who are right here and now, and everybody else, the many. So, but see, that's ignorance and it's obstinacy. That whole translation was done out of obstinacy. It was not done out of generosity and out of love, in my humble opinion. It's very important to remember that phrase in the document on the liturgy. It says that no one should make changes in the liturgy, Marte, in a warlike spirit. That translation was forced down our throats in a warlike spirit. In a warlike spirit. The Germans have rejected it. In Argentina, they never accepted it. Our bishops are so much like weather vanes that they couldn't not say no to the Pope, as if it was the Pope himself who was demanding that we translate it this way. And it was Marte, the warlike spirit.
Do you think the bishops are getting nervous?
Well, I think they're going to have to take a deep breath and stop and think about some things. And the Pope Francis has been very clear that we really have been raising a lot of sand over very minor issues, and this would be one of them. But if they want to make a new translation, let us use the translation that seems best for our parish. You know, and Pope Francis is frequently saying, you know, don't be bending over backwards to keep all these tiny little regulations that really, that's a matter of judgment in the present situation. Well, we are going way over our time. This has been, I thank you, I've been enjoying doing this. What's next? Well, the Pope's recent statement is really delightful. I have a 34-page condensed version of that.
I wonder if we should tape it.
I can make available to you, so if you leave us your emails. It really is very nice, and so that would be something to study I think, I mean, he's saying, he is so humorous. He says, nowadays, most people don't like to spend the time to read long documents like this, but please do, because this is the program. So, get with the program, which is relate to the poor. So, yeah, we should really do that. Our parish, I'm sure we will do some kind of a systematic study of that. In the introductory chapters, paragraph 17, I think, he lists about 8 important topics. Now, then he doesn't have 8 chapters, but those 8 points come up in the rest of the document. That might be a way of studying the document. Just take these 8 points and then see where we can find that supported in the rest of the document. I'm thinking that might be a way of kind of creatively studying, rather than just reading it paragraph by paragraph. What does it say about the poor? What does it say about the clergy? What does it say?